Hello, and welcome inside my chewy head. What kind of person gets locked up in a mental hospital? Someone violent, unpredictable, dangerous? What does it take to end up on an acute psychiatric ward? And if you did, would you ever tell anyone about it? This podcast is about dispelling myths, fear, and stigma surrounding mental health from my own personal experience as a patient. I'm back again with another podcast. How exciting. And today we are talking about Brian. So, Brian, again, met him very early on in my hospital journey. He was a lovely, lovely guy. I remember I met him in the corridor because, there were very limited places that you could actually meet someone. He just seemed really, really friendly. Again, I'm pretty sure that he had some sort of learning difficulty. Again, he was very childish, quite similar in some ways to Tina. And I remember having this conversation with him and him just being very direct and asking me why was I there? What was the reason? And I said, "Oh, I think I'm here because I tried to kill myself. What about you?" And he was just, you could tell he was a bit like, "Oh, I don't really know why you'd want to kill yourself," sort of thing. But hey ho. Brian, it became very, very clear without him even having to tell me what his condition was delusional. He left the conversation, which he did with every conversation that he ever had with anyone, staff, patient, visitor, by saying, "Brian, bless you for the past, present, and the future." And essentially, this was because he thought that he was God. So he had like this, I don't know whether it's schizophrenia. I think it's a form of psychosis, actually. Although, to be fair, schizophrenia is a form of psychosis. So there you go. But I'm not sure that he heard voices, but he definitely believed that he was God. But he was a lovely, lovely man, as I say. He was really sweet, very childlike, had a really close relationship with his mum. His mum would come and visit him and like bring him sweets and crisps. And he'd like come through to me and be like, "Oh, Ellie, I've been eating loads of chocolate today. I won't even want my dinner," sort of thing. And you were like, "Oh, bless you." Bear in mind that he's probably, again, really bad with age, between 30 and 40, I would say, somewhere around that age. So older than me, but absolutely lovely. And he was so lovely that he would literally talk and befriend anyone. So if you were a staff member, you avoided him like the plague because he would literally have you standing there talking to you non-stop. And the nurses will always run off their feet and understaffed, and the healthcare assistants likewise. So they weren't always thrilled to have these extended conversations, which generally revolved around something that might be going on in the ward, or more likely, Brian being God. And I suppose there's only so far you can go with that conversation. But he was so friendly that he even made friends with this one person who came on the ward who was incredibly violent and quite scary. Let's call him Spike, because, bit of a character name there for my English teachers out there. So Spike was so aggressive that eventually he was escorted from the ward by the police because he tried to attack the ward manager, who was this really quite large lady and someone that you didn't really want to mess with. I think he tried to stab her in the eye with a pen. Yeah, he did, because I was on the corridor waiting, as usual, to be let through the doors of the ladies' area. And as usual, there was no one there to let me through, so I was lurking on the corridor. And he couldn't walk properly, Spike. I don't really know why. Something was wrong. I don't know. And I couldn't tell you what was wrong with Spike. So I'm obviously not even a very good pseudo psychologist because half the time haven't the foggiest idea of what people's conditions are. But nevertheless, he was walking along being escorted by a healthcare assistant to help him walk. And at the same time, the ward manager was trying to kind of discuss with Spike that maybe it's not appropriate to be shouting and swearing, and because Spike was very privileged because in the ward there were dormitories, but there were also four separate rooms, and they were given to special patients or patients with extenuating circumstances or specific things that meant that they couldn't be in a dormitory. And would you believe Spike got one of these rooms? Unbelievable. Maybe it was something to do with the fact he couldn't really walk. But anyway, I was very jealous of anyone who had their own room. So she was walking down the corridor with him saying, "You can't be doing what you're doing." And yeah, he just launched himself at her, and she was carrying a pen and I don't know, a clipboard maybe or something. And yeah, he tried to stab her with it. And the police came along. Anyway, most people gave Spike a wide berth for reasons that probably are quite obvious to you and I. But to Brian, they were not obvious. And so he was very happy to be friends with this guy, to sit with him at dinner, to like have nice conversations with him. And even if Spike was quite verbally aggressive and abusive towards Brian, which he was because that was just the way that he was with everyone and he made no exceptions, he was just very patient with him. Brian just didn't let it. It was like water off a duck's back. It didn't bother him at all, which was always quite entertaining to watch because their conversations would often be quite one sided. Brian there telling him how he thought he was God, Spike telling him to fuck off maybe once, and that being kind of the sum of the conversation. But anyway, I used to really, really enjoy Brian and conversations with Brian because he was like a positive element in that ward, and there really weren't many positive elements to that ward, but Brian was one of them, and it was for a similar reason that Tina was one of them, in that he had this childlike innocence about him that made him really, really easy to like and really engaging to be around. And I would always be in the dining room colouring, as I've said, and he would always come in and watch me colour. And I would always be like, "Do you want to colour something? Like, you can try colouring something." And he would always be like, "Yeah, yeah, I do want to." And I'd be like, "Okay, that's fine." So then I'd like give him a colouring pencil or whatever and something to colour. And he would do it for literally about 5 seconds. And then he'd be like, "I can't, I've got to go. I've got to go." And he'd be off. So no attention span whatsoever to colour, but he did appreciate my colouring. And he could always be relied upon to give you a bit of a confidence boost whenever you were feeling a bit low, because he was always very heavy on the praise, which I really appreciated. So that was good. And again, because he was so open and direct about telling me what was wrong with him, he he was very, very kind of blunt about it. So he said to me, and I'll never forget this because it was a really interesting moment. It was one of those moments where you think, "Oh my gosh, this is probably how I come across to other people." So it was a bit of a penny drop moment for me personally, but he said, "I know it sounds mad, but I think I'm God." And the way that he phrased that, it really resonated with me. And I said to him, "Brian, that doesn't sound that mad to me, to be honest." Because to me it didn't at the time, because at the time I was saying that I thought the world would be a better place without me in it, and that my family and close friends and people in my life would be better off without me. And to other people, that sounded mad. And so I could totally understand that Brian had kind of accepted that most people dismissed his way of thinking, but it didn't actually swerve him from having that way of thinking, because that was exactly how I was feeling at the time. And so that was kind of the main, most powerful thing that I actually learned from Brian, was that your perception of the world and other people's don't always correlate, as we all know, but more importantly, other people's perception of the world won't necessarily be enough to change yours, which I thought was really interesting. Anyway, about this time, so I got to know, as I say, Brian fairly early on. And then about 2 weeks into me being in hospital, I had must have been my second ward round. So, yeah, 2 weeks. And I was like, "Do you know what? I don't want to be in hospital anymore. I'm going to try and get out. I'm going to get out of hospital," because hospital was horrendous for all the reasons I stated previously. So essentially, in that ward round, the psychiatrist, and by the way, there were like 4 or 5 psychiatrists. I seem to see a different one every time. Some of them went on holiday. Maybe it was just bad timing. And my husband came to the ward round. He always did. We were sat there, and I said to my husband, "I'm going to get out today." And he was like, "Yeah, all right then," sort of thing. Like, "No, you're not. Don't be silly." He was wrong and I was right, as usual, just saying. So, yeah, so we sat there in the ward round, and the doctor was like, "Oh, how are you feeling?" And I was like, "Yeah, do you know what? I'm feeling so much better. I feel great." He was like, "Oh, really? How do you feel about wanting to kill yourself?" And I was like, "No, I don't really want to kill myself. I feel fine, absolutely fine." And it was almost like I really, really wanted to believe that myself. So even though that wasn't the case, I kind of almost delude. It's like when I was younger and I was at school, maybe other people have done this as well and you can relate, but when I was in primary school, and you had those days where you thought, I'm gonna pretend I'm ill, and then, I won't have to be at school. Brilliant. I mean, what child hasn't done that at some point? But I was so good at pretending that I was ill that teachers would say to me like, "Oh, Ellie, you look really pale, like you look really unwell." And it was basically like I'd made myself ill by just thinking about it. And I suppose I was trying to use that same like power of thought and apply it to the situation of me being in hospital with a diagnosis was actually not given at that stage. So with nothing. being wanting to kill myself essentially. And the doctor was like, "Oh right, okay, that's great. That's fine then. Brilliant. Tell you what." And then essentially at this point, I could have been discharged from hospital and just told, right, that's it, off you go back to the community. You're released back into the wild like a caged bird. But one of the nurses, because obviously, as I've said previously, psychiatrist is God. He appears once a week, not necessarily always the same one. They read through your notes. You often have to go over the same thing again and again and again. And quite honestly, not much changes in your immediate circumstances, given the fact that you're stuck in a ward, but they seem to think that something will have changed. But anyway, the nurses are there with you all the time. And so they're observing you all the time and they observe the way that you behave and whatever. And I was a bit of a wild card for these nurses because I wasn't behaving in a way that would indicate that I was necessarily depressed. Because essentially in hospital, there were three types of people. There were the zombies, and I call them zombies in the most respectful label that I can possibly give them. I mean, I know that that doesn't sound very respectful, but essentially that's what they were like. They were completely mentally vacant. So they would lie in bed, and then sometimes some of them would get up for meals, and they would literally like stare into space, never change out of their pajamas, not wash, not brush their hair, anything. Some of them wouldn't even get out of bed, and they would just lie in bed the whole time. And sometimes you'd be there. Well, I would obviously because I was on this world forever. But sometimes you would literally be able to see them come back to life almost as they kind of recovered part of themselves that had gone or whatever. And that was really fascinating. Yeah. But anyway, so there were the zombies. Then there were the people who were quite clearly in the right place for them because they were raving, they were delusional, they were talking to people who weren't there, they were manic, displaying really, really kind of obvious symptoms of being mentally distressed or confused, let's say. And then there were people who, and I categorize arrogantly myself as one of these, who came across face value very, very normal, like the man in the football shirt, Roger, from last episode, and like myself. There was a lady in there who was I was in there, and genuinely, she was it was like she was on holiday. Every single meal, she had a three-course meal. I'm not joking, even breakfast, because she would have cereal and then she would have toast. I mean, that's only a two-course meal, be fair to her. But, every meal she would have a three-course meal, and she spent most of her day, like, reading these little novels that she had, like crime novels, and I was just baffled. So those were the three types of people. But essentially, they were assuming, the nurses, that as I'd made an attempt on my life, that I would be a zombie category person who would lie in bed all day and not wash and, that sort of thing. And obviously, I didn't meet those expectations because I would get up and I would sit and I would colour and I would wash and I would get dressed. And so they were a bit like, "Oh, okay, that's a bit weird. Like, why is she doing that?" So I was quite unusual. I presented very unusually. However, I was also psychologically very much like a depressed person in that I was hopeless, very, very distressed, very anxious, very panicky, very kind of no sense of optimism at all about the future, as I've previously stated in previous episodes. So one of the nurses was sat in that ward round, and he was like, "Oh, hold on a minute," because this psychiatrist was about to be like, "Off you go, back into the fold of the world," or whatever. And yeah, he was like, "Hold on a minute. I think it might be best if we just let her go on leave. So let's just have her go on leave for the rest of the week." So leave obviously is when you are technically still a patient on their patient list and you still will have a bed in the hospital. So if you decide that you need to come back for whatever reason, you can, or if the doctor decides you need to come back, then you will be able to because there is a physical bed. But obviously you don't have to physically be in the hospital. So he was like, "Well, just what about just leave for a week? What do you think?" And my husband's like, "Yeah, I think that sounds like a really good idea." And I was like, "Yeah, whatever," because I was like, "Oh, I just want to get out of here." And I was so fixated on getting out of hospital. I hadn't really thought much further than that, which is probably because mentally I couldn't really think about the future at all. So I wasn't really thinking about the future or the implications for my husband in terms of the stress and anxiety of having someone who was suicidal at home. Didn't really think about that. And so they released me and I was out and I lasted 2 nights. I lasted 2 nights. My husband was at home with me the whole time. And I literally, the minute I got home, rather than feeling like relief and like, oh yay, I can start my life again. Here I am at home. Let's set up and start cooking. And no, I immediately was like, I shouldn't have come home because I should be dead. I should be dead. I should be dead. And after a while of feeling like that, I was like, oh, maybe I'd be better off in the hospital. So eventually I ended up back in hospital. And that was when I really just took a really massive dive off the hopeless despair diving board and landed in a pool of complete self-loathing and pity and fear and general wanting to be deadness, if that is a term. Maybe there is a term for that. I'm not half as eloquent as I pretend to be. Anyway, in the meantime, so I'd been out of hospital for 2 days, right? And in the meantime, what Brian had been doing is Brian had been drawing a picture, a diagram. So he'd created this really, really intricate diagram. Now, bear in mind, as I've said, Brian had very little attention span. So for him to have sat there and filled, and I'm not joking, it was literally the entire A4 piece of paper was covered with all these different colors and like not scribbles, that's disrespectful, they weren't scribbles, but these detailed drawings that created this diagram. And the diagram was basically a summary of his religious philosophy. And so when I got back, in my head, I'm thinking, I can't survive on the outside. I don't want to be in here. I don't want to be alive. I'm going to just now try and kill myself as quickly as possible. That was what was going on in my head. Not much else, to be honest with you. Occasionally, I thought about Oreos, and I ate far too many. I ate so many Oreos in hospital over the course of those 3 months that if I never eat one again, it will be too soon. So he sees me and he's really excited because you know, I'm such a cheerful beacon of hope and light in his life, or not. But anyway, he's like, "Oh, Ellie, let me show you my diagram." So he literally, I've just arrived back on the ward, and he's like, sat me down, and he's showing me this diagram. And I'm not going to sit here and pretend that I could tell you every inch of that diagram, but essentially, it was this idea of dualism, I suppose. So good versus evil, and he was God, and that was good. And if you were good, then you went to heaven. But if you weren't good, then you would go to the Antichrist, and he was in hell. And it was almost, do you know what it reminded me of? Is like the water cycle, that you did at school, where like the rain comes down. I mean, Google it. I'm not going to go through the whole water cycle, but it really reminded me of that. Except with a religion that he had created and was it wasn't even really. I don't think he even really necessarily created it. It more just came about in his reality. And he was really, really proud of this. And so I was like, oh, that's amazing, Brian. Like, well done. That's great. And he kept showing it to me. He showed it to me at least once a day after that. And I still can't remember every detail of it. So that just goes to show how intricate it was. But to me, this manifestation and the detail of this diagram was like an indicator that actually this wasn't as simple for Brian as just thinking that he was God. Like this was, as I said, reality that was going on around him. And this became really, really apparent when bad things happened on the ward. So, like, for example, when Spike decided he was going to stab the ward manager in the eye with a pen and the police came, or, oh, when this horrendous woman, who I will definitely have an episode, maybe even two on, arrived on the ward and caused utter chaos the entire time that she was there. Anytime that it was really like tense or aggressive or manic, because it kind of was like, I don't know, it went through stages. It was like waves, I suppose. Like literally, things would build and build and build, and then there'd be a big crescendo. And sometimes you'd have a day where alarms would be going off all the time because anytime someone tried to kill themselves, the alarm would go off. Well, if I'm trying to kill myself, let's say 2, 3 times a day, somebody else is trying to kill themselves, someone else is having a violent moment. All of these things, there's alarms going off the whole day. And for all the other patients, what that does is it works them up into this anxious frenzy and is obviously very negative for people like Brian, who was very, very sensitive. And essentially, he came into me in the ladies' lounge. This is why it's not a ladies' lounge, because literally anyone could go in there. And there was this one man who, again, I'll have an episode on him, but he decided that that was his bedroom and he was going to live in there and sleep in there. The man did not wash. The room smelt. It used to absolutely infuriate me. However, not for this episode. Brian comes in and he's really, really worked up. And I'm like, Brian, what's wrong? Calm down. And he's literally panicking, and I can see the panic on his face. And bless him, I have another soft spot for Brian. So I'm trying to ease his suffering, obviously. And he's like, oh, the ward's really crazy and it's making me feel really uncomfortable. And I was like, yeah, I know. And he was like, and I know it's my fault. It's my fault. I was like, I don't think it's your fault. It's not your fault if Spike's decided to stab the woman with a pen. Like, that's not to do with you, really. I don't think you can take responsibility for that. He was like, "No, it is my fault. It's because I'm God and the Antichrist is coming after me, and this is how he does it. He does it through all of these things." And at that point, I was like, "Wow." In some ways, bear with me because I think this is a fair point to make. Believing that you're God must be pretty good because if you're God, right? You're God. You're the most powerful being on earth. You know the answer to everything. So in some ways, you would think, or maybe just that was me at the time with my crazy mind, but you would think that that would be almost quite nice. But the reality was that it really wasn't because it was really distressing for Brian because he actually was taking accountability for everything that went on. And I guess that's a double-sided coin, isn't it? Because not everything that went on was positive. And so this sensitivity was really, really a problem for him. And it would prevent him from sleeping. He would get very, very upset. He would cry. I'm not very good with people who cry. One story of him crying, though, was particularly funny, and I know you shouldn't laugh at other people's expense, but hear the story and then you make your own judgments about how bad of a person I am. So, as I said previously, you ordered your dinner and your lunch the day before. So, you filled out this little menu and you had your choice, and it was normally like, what meat do you want? What carbohydrate? And do you want peas or a salad? It was that sort of thing. And basically, it would be stuff like sausages, mash, carrots, and then you ticked if you wanted vegetarian sausages. Like it wasn't really. I'm basically telling you this because it's important to the story. I'm not trying to insult anyone's intelligence about how you would make a meal. Brian had ordered himself dinner, and it was sausage and mash that night, and carrots and whatever else. And as I said in the last episode, sometimes people would come along. I don't know who they were. Maybe it was the staff. Who knows? I don't know. It wasn't me. That's all I know. And they would scribble out other people's orders. And I don't know why you would want to do that, but they did. Maybe they were bored. I don't know. And so essentially, when dinner arrived, they called out your name and you were given your tray. And so they called out Brian's name and his tray came and it was literally just a plate with some mashed potato on and there was nothing else. And obviously he's a fully grown man and he just stared at this mashed potato and everyone on our table kind of went a bit quiet, looked at him, and then people laughed because it was quite funny. And it was funny because this sort of thing happened all the time and like even though we'd raised concerns, because basically once a week there was supposedly a meeting in which they took on our feedback about things on the ward that weren't necessarily that great. I mean, one of the points that I raised at one of these meetings was that we have this meeting every week, but I never hear any follow up of actions that were taken. That doesn't seem to happen. But anyway, so people had raised the food problems with orders before and nothing happened. And to be honest, in these situations, it's laugh or cry. So we chose to laugh. But Brian chose to cry and he cried hysterically. And so if you can just picture like a fully grown man sat at a table crying into a plate of mashed potato, it's either hilarious or it's devastatingly sad, one or the other. I'm not sure really which. But he would go on about this moment and he would bring it up for weeks and he would tell me about it. And I was like, yes, Brian, I was there. I was at your table. I remember it. But he was so sensitive and he would hold on to these moments. And to him, they would work into his psychosis, I suppose, and his delusion of thinking that he was God and how somehow it was the Antichrist coming after him. But the interesting thing about Brian, other than obviously the fact that he thought that he was God, was that he was from the same place that I was from. And I actually got to see Brian, and I have seen him a couple of times now, out and about, because he lives very near where I live. One of the best memories, not just with Brian, but of my entire time of hospital, is this one. So every week, or not even every week, once in a while, couldn't really tell you the rota. I don't really think anything really ran by a routine, as I've mentioned previously in this hospital, really. But every so often, this pastor would come in, or vicar, or they're supposed to be like non-denominational religious person, but obviously they were Christian. And she would come in and try and talk to the patients, I suppose. And I'm sure it came from a place of like compassion and wanting to love people, God's children, and all of this. But it didn't feel like that. It kind of felt like I'm coming here to actively pit. Well, to me, it did. And remember that my mind is negative and bitter and angry, right? So I'm not really the most receptive person to someone talking to me about God at this moment in time because I want to be dead. I don't want to be in hospital. the world is against me, woe is me. That was my attitude. So I was a tough audience for any vicar or pastor or member of any religious leader community thing. But anyway, she would come in, she would try and talk to you, and I would be like, look, no. In fact, I actually said, do you not think that it's probably slightly manipulative to seek out vulnerable people at their most vulnerable times and start messing around with their concepts of God and their belief? Because again, that's my bitter, pessimistic way of thinking. When actually, what she was probably trying to do was inspire hope, but I didn't see that at the time. But anyway, she was talking to me, and I was thinking, my God, I don't want to be talking to you. Irony there, my God, see what I did? So I said, have you met Brian? And she was like, no, who's Brian? I was like, oh, I think you would really, really benefit from having a conversation with Brian. I think that actually the two of you have quite a lot in common. And so she was like, oh, brilliant. Because, to be honest with you, as I said, you've got the three different types of people. The zombies are really not good. I mean, you might as well just talk to yourself if you were a pastor, because you're not getting anything out of them. And they're most likely in bed. So you probably can't even access them. Equally, the people who are raving and manic, well, you just can't get through to them at all. So you can't really be talking with them. And the people like me, well, I mean, talking to me was really not something that anyone would have wanted to do voluntarily. So anyway, so she was thrilled that I'd found someone for her that was willing to have a conversation, a theological discussion about God. So I was like, brilliant, you stay here and I'll just pop in and get Brian for you. So then off I trot. I went in. Brian was in one of the men's dormitories. By the way, I got in so much trouble for that as well. I went into this dormitory, and the activities coordinator lady, who used to wind me up quite a lot, the Christmas card champion, shall we call her, she was like, Ellie, what do you think you're doing? And I was like, oh, I'm getting Brian because the vicar wants to have a word with him. She was like, no, excuse me, you cannot go in the men's dormitory. I was like, right, it's literally, I don't know, 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and I'm going into a room to introduce someone to a vicar. I don't think that there's anything sexual or inappropriate going on here. Do you? But I obviously it didn't really say any of that. I was just like, right, okay then. But anyway, I got in trouble and it annoyed me, and I remember that, so I just thought I'd let you know. I took Brian and I made the introductions. Honestly, it was comedy gold, absolute comedy gold, as I knew it would be. And again, looking back now, was this a nice, honest, positive thing that for me to do? No, it wasn't. I was a terrible person and probably still am, because I still find it funny that they were having a conversation in which at one point he whipped out his diagram and was explaining to her about God and the fact that he was God, and you could tell that she was just like growing in this like unbelievable panic at what to do. And honestly, she was there. She definitely was there longer than she normally was, and she definitely earned her money that day. And you know what? It made Brian feel great. He really, really enjoyed that conversation. He left that conversation buzzing. So, did I do a positive thing? Actually, conversely, perhaps I did. It definitely made me have a little laugh, a little moment of joy in an otherwise very depressing environment. So, to summarize, Brian, what did I learn from Brian? Well, as I've said, I learned from Brian that actually the way I was thinking was probably mad to other people in the same way that Brian's ideas might have seemed mad to other people. And that essentially it was probably one of the first times that I realized, like, oh, I'm in hospital with people like Brian because people think that I belong here in the same way that they think that Brian belongs here. And I thought that that was really interesting. I didn't necessarily accept that idea, but I definitely had that idea suggested to me, and I definitely learnt that from him. What does he say about society? What can we learn from Brian about society? Well, unfortunately, this is going to be a bit of a common theme here, and I am sorry for this. And if there is a success story out there, I will be the first. I mean, maybe I'm the success story. Maybe they should put me on a poster for psychiatric units. That would be really something. Maybe I should suggest that. Maybe they'd put me straight back in the ward, so maybe not. But anyway, unfortunately, Brian also was failed in the same similar ways to how Tina was failed. And I know this because, as I said, Brian is from the same area that I am from. And so when I saw him in the street, I was like, "Oh my gosh, Brian, how are you? What's been going on?" And he was like, "Oh, I've not been very well at all," because he was released while I was still in hospital, just like everybody else was. I'm not bitter about it, can you tell? basically once a week, tended to be on a Monday, which ironically was the day that I was also released for 2 nights, but anyway. They tended to have a clear out. I don't know whether they had targets or whatever, but literally it would be like a mass exodus, a massive cull of all these patients, and like half of them you'd be like, "Really? This person's being allowed to go home? Are we joking? Is this a joke?" And Brian was one of those people because I was like, hold on a minute, you're going home. You, Brian, are going home when you still believe very strongly that you are God and the Antichrist is after you, and everything that happens and that you do on earth right now in this ward has a massive impact on everybody else because you are God. You, Brian, believing all of that, is allowed to go home, and I am not allowed to go home. What? To me, I found that very difficult. That was a bitter pill to swallow. So when I saw him in the street, I was really keen because I wanted the best for Brian, and I still do because he was a lovely guy, as I've said. And I wouldn't really ever want negative things for anyone because although I might be a bit bitter and a bit twisted, I actually genuinely have good intentions for everyone. And I wouldn't want anybody else to suffer, especially not someone who's been in a mental health ward because by being in one, you've suffered enough. But yeah, so I was like, "Brian, how are you? What's been going on?" And he was like, "Oh, I haven't been well. I've been back in hospital." So he came out of hospital, and within a month he was back in hospital, and he stayed there for another couple of months, and he'd just been released again from hospital. And I was like, "And how are you feeling now?" And he was like, "I feel really bad." And I found that really, really hard to hear because when Brian was in hospital with me, that was obviously my first and hopefully touch wood last time ever of being in hospital. But for him, that was a reoccurring thing. And so this man is on a revolving door, which means that he never ever is given the treatment that enables him to recover or move on or overcome his mental health issues. That never happens for him. He just goes round and round and round those same doors. And I, again, find that really, really tragic that in our society, with all the scientific advancements that we have and all the medical research and all the money that we have here in the West as well, are we putting that into our people? Not necessarily, because if we are, the medication that some of these people are getting would be enough for them to maintain a positive life in the community. And the reality is, the medication that they're being given is something that it's almost like the emperor's new clothes. We're pretending that that's working for people like Brian. Well, if it's working, why is he ending up back in hospital? Don't know. Find it baffling. What do I feel that we can all learn from Brian, and what hopefully you can learn and take away from my experiences with Brian? Well, I would hope that you would, if you hadn't already, and again, this is me making a huge assumption about your understanding and appreciation and education about mental health that may be actually far, far greater than mine. And so I'm not trying to come across as patronizing at all, but this is just something that really struck me that I thought would be a really good thing if more people appreciated about mental health. And that is that not everyone perceives the world in the same way as you do. So even things that you take for granted as facts, for example, that life is worth living, most people, they probably don't even really have to entertain that thought. They just kind of accept that and go about their daily business. And it's not really anything that appears on their radar. They probably haven't had an actual conscious conversation with themselves in the morning and gone, right, should I live my life today? But that fact that you assume is part and parcel of life isn't necessarily the same for everyone. So for Brian, he was God. That was his reality. And me telling him that he wasn't God was futile because that's his perception of reality and remains so to this day. I tell you what, as well, the other day I bumped into him. Where had he been? Church. I thought, I hope these vicars are getting a pay rise. Anyway, back to my more serious message here. My serious message is what I'm trying to say is that our perceptions of facts and our perceptions of reality might be ever so slightly different to other people's. And if we are aware of that, we're much more likely to be understanding and sensitive and appreciative of the nuances that create other people's realities. Right. I feel like that's Brian done and dusted in a nutshell. If I see him around, I'll definitely let you guys know. Thank you so much for listening again to my latest instalment of this wonderful podcast. I'm so happy that you've come and listened, and I would love it if you would like to continue the conversation with me over on my socials, my social media, because I'm down with the kids. All of them are listed down below, but they're all a variant of Chewy Head podcast, essentially. Equally, if you feel like you really want to stick around, please do subscribe and become part of a new space on the internet where we can create a community that is supportive of mental health. See you next time when I'll be talking about Philip. And trust me, Philip takes everything to a new level.